Hey everyone, settle in tonight for a story about what happens after the unthinkable. Not the flash, not the blast, but the decades that came after, when ordinary people had to figure out how to keep living in a world that had proven itself capable of anything. This is a story about survivors, about a city that grew flowers out of scorched earth, about a little girl and her paper cranes, and about the strange, stubborn, deeply human work of choosing peace after living through its opposite. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these quiet explorations of history, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're settling in from tonight. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step gently into the story of Hiroshima's survivors. On the morning of August 6, 1945, at 8:15, an American B-29 bomber released a single weapon over the city of Hiroshima. It detonated about 600 meters above the ground, near the T-shaped Aioi Bridge, and in the space of a heartbeat the temperature at ground level reached several thousand degrees. Wood-framed houses, which made up most of the city's homes, simply ceased to exist within a wide radius of the blast. Concrete buildings closer in were gutted. Streetcars, of which there were 63 running that morning, were thrown, burned, or flattened where they stood. By the end of that year, somewhere in the neighborhood of 140,000 people had died. Estimates vary, and probably always will, because so many bodies were never identified and so many deaths from radiation sickness in the weeks that followed were never formally counted as bombing casualties at all. But behind every estimate stood an actual person. A child on the way to school. A woman hanging laundry. A grandfather sitting down to breakfast. A whole ordinary Monday morning, interrupted forever. Those who lived through that morning and its aftermath came to be known, in Japanese, as hibakusha, which means something close to explosion-affected people. It's a quiet, almost clinical term for an experience that defies quiet, clinical description, and that contrast matters, because the way Japan has talked about the bombing, officially and unofficially, has often carried this same tension between bureaucratic language and unbearable human reality. Under Japanese law, hibakusha status is granted to people who were within a few kilometers of either hypocenter when the bombs fell, to those who entered the affected areas within about 2 weeks afterward while radiation levels remained dangerous, to those exposed to radioactive fallout, and to those who were unborn, carried in the womb by a mother who met any of these conditions. Since 1945, the Japanese government has recognized somewhere around 650,000 people as hibakusha in total. That number tells you something important right away. Surviving the initial blast was, tragically, almost the easy part. What came after, for hundreds of thousands of people, was decades of living with a body that had been exposed to something science itself was still trying to understand. As of this recording, the population of certified hibakusha has fallen below 100,000 for the first time since Japan began issuing survivor certificates in 1957. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare reported that the number stood at 99,130 as of the end of March 2025, and by the following spring that number had dropped further, into the low 90s of thousands, with the average age of the remaining survivors climbing past 86 years old. Every March, the ministry publishes this count, and every year it gets smaller, sometimes by 7,000 or 8,000 people in a single 12-month span. There is something quietly devastating about a statistic that exists purely to measure disappearance. The generation that could say, in their own voice, "I was there, I remember the flash, I remember the sound," is leaving us, year by year, and the world is entering a stretch of history it has never faced before, a nuclear age with no living witnesses to the only 2 times such weapons were ever used against people. But let's go back, gently, to the days and weeks immediately following the bombing, because that's where the story of survival actually begins, and it began in conditions almost impossible to imagine from the comfort of wherever you're listening tonight. The city that had existed that morning was gone. Streets that survivors had walked their whole lives no longer had any landmarks to navigate by. People wandered through the wreckage calling out names, hoping for an answer that, in most cases, never came. The rivers running through the city, the Motoyasu among them, filled with the bodies of those who had jumped in seeking relief from burns so severe that ordinary touch was unbearable, and many who jumped in simply didn't have the strength left to climb back out. Survivors who lived to tell their stories described people walking with their arms held out in front of them, away from their bodies, because their skin, hanging loose in places, hurt too much to brush against anything, even their own clothing. Others sat quietly in small groups, too injured to move, waiting for a kind of help that mostly wasn't coming, because so many of the people capable of providing it had themselves been killed or wounded. Within hours, something even stranger began happening to people who initially appeared uninjured. They started vomiting. Their heads pounded. Purple spots bloomed under their skin. Their hair came loose in clumps. Their gums bled and would not stop. Nobody around them, including many of the doctors who were still able to work, had ever seen anything quite like it, because nobody had ever needed to understand what a lethal dose of ionizing radiation does to a human body in real time. This was acute radiation syndrome, and it worked by quietly dismantling the body's ability to replace and repair its own cells. Bone marrow failed. Immune systems that would normally fight off infection simply stopped functioning. People who had walked away from the blast with no visible wounds at all died in the days and weeks that followed, sometimes suddenly, sometimes after a long and confusing decline that no one around them could explain. The scale of destruction meant that formal medical care was, for a terrible stretch of time, almost non-existent. Most of Hiroshima's hospitals and clinics had been destroyed or severely damaged, and a huge share of the city's doctors and nurses were themselves among the dead or wounded. Relief efforts had to be improvised almost entirely from what remained, which was not very much. And yet, in the middle of all this, people helped each other. Strangers carried the injured to whatever shelter still stood. People with only minor injuries themselves worked to pull others from collapsed buildings. This is a detail that's easy to lose in the scale of the tragedy, but it matters, even in the first hours after the worst thing that had ever happened to their city. Ordinary people in Hiroshima were still choosing, again and again, small acts of care toward each other. The recovery of basic infrastructure, when it came, arrived with a speed that still surprises people who study this period closely. 2 days after the bombing, on August 8th, a section of the Japanese National Railways line reopened between Hiroshima and a nearby station. The very next day, August 9th, streetcar service partially resumed on one stretch of track, between what's now called Nishi Hiroshima and Tenmacho stations, and on that first restored streetcar, passengers who had no money were allowed to ride for free. Survivors later described the simple sight of a streetcar running again, bell ringing, wheels turning on tracks that had so recently been buried in ash and debris, as something that gave people hope in a moment when hope was in desperately short supply. It's worth pausing on this, because it's such a small, human detail against the scale of the disaster, a tram car. Of the company's 108 streetcars, about 90% had been damaged or destroyed, and more than 40 were burned or wrecked beyond repair. The Hiroshima Electric Railway lost 185 employees that day, including students and staff from a girls' vocational school the company had established to keep the trains running during wartime labor shortages. And yet, 3 days later, the survivors among that same workforce had trains moving again. A handful of those very streetcars, numbered 651, 652, and 653, having been repaired by surviving railway staff, are still running on the streets of Hiroshima today, 8 decades later, carrying commuters and school children past the very ruins they once rolled through in the opposite direction, as wreckage rather than as transit. For days after the bombing, the electric water pump at one of the city's water stations came back online, though it would take a full 9 months before water service was properly restored to the outer parts of the city, because the underground pipe network had been ruptured in so many places that repair crews had to work almost block by block. Food and shelter, in those early weeks, were desperately short. Hiroshima's population, which had fallen to something like 83,000 people immediately after the bombing as residents fled or died, actually swelled again over the following months, reaching around 169,000 by February of 1946, as evacuees returned, as demobilized soldiers made their way home, and as civilians repatriated from Japan's former overseas territories arrived looking for family and shelter. But only a small fraction of that population, somewhere around 6,500 people, actually lived within a kilometer of the city center, because that area remained largely uninhabitable rubble for years. A council was convened as early as December of 1945 just to manage the distribution of lumber, nails, glass, and charcoal, because even the most basic materials for rebuilding a life were in desperately short supply. Children went to what people called blue sky classrooms, lessons held outdoors, sometimes literally sitting on the scorched ground, because there were no school buildings left standing to hold them. Now, here's something that predictions at the time got spectacularly, wonderfully wrong. Some of the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, trying to estimate the long-term effects of the bombing, suggested that the ground around the hypocenter had been so thoroughly poisoned that nothing would grow there again for 70 years, maybe 75. It was a reasonable guess, given how little anyone actually understood about radiation and soil chemistry at that point in history. It also turned out to be wrong within a matter of months. That same autumn, weeds began pushing up through the ash. The following summer, something even more striking happened. Oleander bushes, planted along the city's rivers and in its parks before the war, bloomed. Bright red and white flowers opening on scorched earth that experts had all but written off. Around the same time, old camphor trees that had been burned down to blackened stumps started sending out tender new shoots. Nobody had expected this. Survivors who had been told, essentially, that their home was dead for the next several generations watched instead as it stubbornly, quietly insisted on living. Decades later, in 1973, the people of Hiroshima voted to formally adopt the oleander as their city's official flower and the camphor as its official tree, specifically because those were the plants that had returned first, blooming and budding in defiance of every expert prediction, becoming living symbols of a resilience that the city's human residents recognized in themselves. There's an even more particular category of survivor that Hiroshima keeps careful track of, the Hibakujumoku, or survivor trees, meaning specific individual trees that were growing within roughly 2 kilometers of the hypocenter and lived through the blast. Ginkgo trees especially seem to have this stubborn quality. Several ginkgos that were scorched down to blackened trunks put out fresh green buds within months, astonishing residents who had assumed they were looking at deadwood. Seeds and cuttings from some of these very trees have since been sent around the world as gestures of peace, planted in botanical gardens and city halls in places like Edinburgh and Cornwall, carrying, quite literally, genetic material that survived Hiroshima's worst morning into gardens thousands of miles away, where they now grow as living reminders that devastation is not always the last word. The human survivors, of course, faced a much more complicated road back to anything resembling normal life, because unlike a tree, a person carries memory, and unlike a tree, a person has to live inside a body that might, at any point, reveal some new and delayed consequence of that morning in August. This uncertainty turned out to be one of the cruelest parts of surviving. For years, doctors and researchers were still working out exactly what radiation exposure would eventually do to different people, at different distances, at different doses, and in the meantime, survivors lived with a kind of low, constant dread. Would this headache turn into something worse? Would their hair loss be permanent? Would a child conceived after the bombing be born healthy? There were no confident answers, only patterns that emerged slowly and painfully over years of quiet, careful observation. The single most significant long-term health consequence to emerge from this research involved the thyroid, and it involved children most of all. When the bomb detonated, among the many radioactive substances released was iodine-131, an isotope with a short half-life of only about 8 days. Short half-lives sound reassuring, but in this case it was almost the opposite of good news, because within that brief window, radioactive iodine settled onto grass and crops across the region. Dairy cattle grazed on that contaminated vegetation and concentrated the iodine in their milk. Children drank that milk, and their thyroid glands, which are remarkably efficient at absorbing iodine from whatever source is available, pulled that radioactive iodine directly into thyroid tissue and irradiated it at close range, for weeks, from the inside. Children's thyroids are smaller than adults, and children's metabolisms are faster, which meant they absorbed proportionally higher doses for their body size. The consequences of this took years, sometimes a full decade, to surface. Researchers eventually found that thyroid cancer diagnoses among people who had been children at the time of the bombings rose well above expected rates. By 2005, roughly 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer had been documented among that population, with around 5,000 of them specifically attributed to the contaminated milk consumed in the weeks after the bombings. 15 of those cases proved fatal, a relatively low fatality rate that reflects the fact that thyroid cancer, while serious and frightening, is often treatable when caught early, which meant that decades of ongoing medical monitoring of hibakusha communities likely saved a significant number of lives. Beyond thyroid cancer, the broader picture of radiation's long-term effects turned out to be genuinely complicated, and honestly, it still is. Among the roughly 600 workers who were on site in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, about 134 developed acute radiation syndrome, and among those who survived that initial crisis, researchers documented increased rates of leukemia and cataracts in the years that followed. But for people who received lower doses of radiation, further from the hypocenter, the picture blurs. Some studies have suggested possible increases in breast cancer and other cancers among broader affected populations, but these findings have never been conclusively and universally confirmed, partly because it is extraordinarily difficult to isolate the effects of one specific exposure from everything else that influences a person's health across 7 or 8 decades of an ordinary life. What is not remotely ambiguous, though, and what researchers describe as absolutely unmistakable, are the psychological effects. Chronic stress. Anxiety that never fully resolves. Grief that gets reactivated by something as small as a headache or a doctor's raised eyebrow. The trauma of having watched entire families disappear in a single morning. These psychological wounds, layered onto physical uncertainty and social stigma, created a kind of suffering that no medical treatment alone could ever fully address, and for many hibakusha, this was arguably the heaviest burden of all, heavier in some ways than any specific diagnosis. Because here's the part of this story that tends to get less attention than the bombing itself, and it deserves more. Hibakusha, upon surviving, often found themselves facing discrimination so severe that many chose to hide their survivor status for the rest of their lives. Some of this discrimination grew out of pure, understandable fear mixed with genuine ignorance about how radiation actually worked. Many people in Japan believed, mistakenly, that radiation exposure was somehow contagious, that simply being near a hibakusha could transmit contamination, in the same way you might catch a cold from someone sneezing near you. Combined with genuine uncertainty, even among doctors, about whether radiation damage could be passed down genetically to children, this fear made hibakusha, in the eyes of some of their own neighbors and countrymen, socially untouchable. Young survivors carrying visible injuries or scars faced discrimination in hiring. And the discrimination fell with particular cruelty on women. Female hibakusha were frequently rejected as marriage prospects, sometimes because of visible keloid scarring from severe burns, and sometimes purely out of suspicion that they might carry some hidden hereditary damage that would be passed to their children. Think about what that actually meant, in practice, for a young woman who had survived an atomic bombing, who had endured radiation sickness and years of chronic health anxiety, who carried both physical scars and psychological ones from an experience almost nobody else on Earth could relate to, only to then be told by a prospective husband's family that she was undesirable because she might produce defective children. It is hard to imagine a crueler compounding of injury on top of injury, and yet it happened, over and over, in ordinary households across post-war Japan. Many hibakusha responded to this reality by simply going quiet. They didn't tell employers. They didn't tell neighbors. In some cases, they didn't even tell the people they eventually married. They carried a secret that could never quite be shared, managing health anxieties privately because seeking treatment for a radiation-related illness might reveal the very status they were trying to hide. and for those who did marry without disclosure, and who later had children, there was a particular kind of quiet torment that followed. If a child ever developed any health problem at all, a mother might spend sleepless nights wondering whether it traced back to that morning in August, whether some invisible damage in her own cells had reached forward across a decade to touch her child. This fear was made worse by an official silence that lasted for years. For nearly a decade after the bombings, survivors in occupied Japan were not permitted to speak openly or publish freely about the bombing's aftermath, and neither the American nor the Japanese government provided the kind of systematic medical assistance and public acknowledgement that might have eased some of this burden. Many people who had survived the initial blast died during that decade of official quiet, their suffering essentially undocumented, their stories untold. The silence didn't hold forever, though, and the moment that finally cracked it open had nothing directly to do with Hiroshima or Nagasaki at all. In 1954, an American hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific exposed a Japanese fishing crew aboard a boat called the Lucky Dragon No. 5 to radioactive fallout, sickening the crew and eventually killing one of them. The incident caused an international uproar, and for the first time, it created space for Hibakusha to begin speaking publicly about what they had experienced, because suddenly the whole country understood, viscerally, that nuclear weapons weren't a closed chapter of history from 1945. They were a present and ongoing danger. Public pressure grew, and in 1955 the Japanese parliament allocated funding for Hibakusha medical expenses for the first time. A year after that, in 1956, survivors formed what's known today as Nihon Hidankyo, the Japan Confederation of A and H-bomb sufferers organizations, and their founding appeal to the world contained a single, devastatingly simple line: there should never be another Hibakusha. It's worth sitting with that phrase for a moment, because it says so much about how these survivors chose to carry their own suffering forward. They could have simply demanded recognition, or compensation, or an apology, all of which would have been entirely reasonable. Instead, the core of their message was preventive. Never again should anyone else have to become what we became. That focus on the future rather than personal grievance has defined the Hibakusha movement for nearly 7 decades now, and it's a big part of why, in October of 2024, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Nihon Hidankyo, honoring the organization specifically for its efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and for demonstrating, through decades of witness testimony, that these weapons must never be used again. The Nobel Committee's chair described the Hibakusha's role in language that stuck with a lot of people who heard it. He said the survivors helped the rest of us describe the indescribable, think the unthinkable, and somehow grasp the incomprehensible pain and suffering caused by nuclear weapons. Toshiyuki Mimaki, the group's co-chair, responded to the prize by saying, simply, that nuclear weapons should absolutely be abolished, and that he hoped the honor would give the movement's message new force at a moment when, in his words, the taboo against ever using such weapons again feels like it's under real pressure. Some individual survivors, in particular, became the human face of this decades-long advocacy, and their stories are worth knowing in detail, because statistics about casualty counts, however staggering, don't actually teach us very much about what survival felt like from the inside. Setsuko Thurlow was 13 years old on the morning of the bombing, reporting for her first day of assigned wartime work at an army base roughly a mile from where the bomb detonated. She remembered a bluish-white flash, and then the sensation of her body being flung through the air, floating, before she found herself trapped beneath a collapsed building alongside dozens of other people. A stranger eventually pulled her free. What she saw when she emerged, she later said, was almost beyond description, a city she knew intimately, transformed into something unrecognizable, darkness hanging over the ruins even though the sun had already been up for nearly 2 hours. Among the dead were members of her own family and, over time, 351 of her schoolmates. Thurlow eventually moved to Canada, built a career in social work, and spent the better part of 70 years traveling the world to tell her story, becoming one of the most recognizable voices behind the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, known as ECON, which was awarded its own Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its role in helping the United Nations adopt a treaty banning nuclear weapons outright. Thurlow stood on stage in Oslo that December to accept the prize, an 80-something-year-old woman who had once been a 13-year-old girl pulled from rubble, telling the assembled diplomats and dignitaries that this was, in her words, the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons, and that she had been waiting 7 decades for that day to arrive. Then there is the story that has probably traveled further around the world than any other single account from Hiroshima, the story of a little girl named Sadako Sasaki. Sadako was 2 years old on the morning of the bombing, at home with her family, about a mile from the hypocenter. The blast wave blew her clear out of a window. Her mother ran outside expecting to find her daughter dead and instead found her alive, with no visible injuries at all. Sadako grew into a strong, cheerful, athletic child, well liked by her classmates, known especially for being fast on her feet. She was the anchor runner on her relay team in elementary school. Nothing about her outward health suggested that anything at all had happened to her that morning nearly a decade earlier. Then, in November of 1954, small marks that looked like chicken pox appeared on her neck. By January of the following year, purple spots had begun forming on her legs. During a school relay race that her team won, she felt suddenly dizzy and exhausted, and the dizziness kept worsening until, one day, she collapsed and couldn't get back up. Her parents took her to the Red Cross Hospital, where doctors delivered the diagnosis, leukemia, which people in Hiroshima at the time simply called atomic bomb disease, because everyone understood, by then, exactly where it came from. Doctors told her family she likely had less than a year to live. She was admitted to the hospital on February 21, 1955, at just 12 years old. That August, Sadako's closest friend, a girl named Chizuko Hamamoto, came to visit her in the hospital and brought a sheet of gold origami paper. Chizuko cut it into a square, folded it into the shape of a crane, and told Sadako an old Japanese legend. The crane is a sacred bird, said to live for 1,000 years, and if a sick person folds 1,000 paper cranes, they will be granted a single wish. Sadako's wish, understandably, was simple. She wanted to get well. She wanted to leave the hospital and go back to school and keep running relay races with her friends. She began folding cranes out of anything she could get her hands on, medicine wrapping paper, scraps donated by nurses and fellow patients, because actual origami paper was hard to come by. She strung the finished cranes up around her hospital bed, a small flock of paper hope hanging over her as her condition slowly worsened. Her older brother Masahiro, who has spent much of his own long life keeping his sister's story alive and accurate, has said that Sadako never once complained about her pain during her entire hospital stay, and in fact refused pain medication at times because she understood how expensive her treatment was for her family and didn't want to add to that burden. There's a particular Japanese phrase, omuyara no kokoro, which describes a quality of considering others even while suffering yourself, and Masahiro has said it's exactly what his sister embodied, right up until the end. According to Masahiro and the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, which has studied the surviving documentation closely, Sadako didn't just reach her goal of 1,000 cranes, she exceeded it substantially, folding somewhere over 1,300 cranes before she died, working her way well into a second round of 1,000. A popular, more dramatic version of the story, the one that made it into an internationally beloved children's book, claims she died having completed only 644 cranes, with her classmates finishing the remaining number after her death. Masahiro has spent years gently insisting that this version, while emotionally understandable, isn't accurate to what actually happened. His sister met her goal, and kept going anyway. In mid-October of 1955, her left leg swelled and turned purple. Her family urged her to eat something. She asked for tea over rice, tasted it, said it was delicious, and thanked her family. Those were her last words. On October 25, 1955, surrounded by family and by more than 1,000 paper cranes hanging above her, Sadako Sasaki died. She was 12 years old. Her classmates were devastated, and in their grief, they did something remarkable. They organized a paper crane club in her memory, and word of what they were doing spread far beyond their own school. Eventually, students from more than 3,000 schools across Japan, and from 9 other countries, sent in donations to fund a permanent monument. On May 5, 1958, almost 3 years after Sadako's death, that monument, now known as the Children's Peace Monument, was unveiled in the heart of Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, close to the spot where the bomb had detonated. The statue depicts Sadako standing with a folded crane held above her head, reaching toward the sky. At its base, a simple stone plaque carries an inscription that has since traveled around the world. "This is our cry. This is our prayer. Peace in the world." Every year, especially during the Obon holiday, when families across Japan traditionally honor the memory of departed relatives, people leave paper cranes at the base of that statue by the thousands, and school children from around the globe fold and mail cranes to be placed there too. By some estimates, roughly 10 million paper cranes arrive at the monument each year, a quiet, ongoing river of folded paper carrying wishes that nobody else will ever have to fold cranes from a hospital bed the way Sadako did. Her story reached much of the world through a 1977 children's book, and through that book, generations of children who never lived anywhere near Japan learned about the cost of nuclear weapons not through casualty statistics but through the life of one specific 12-year-old girl who loved to run and who thought of her family, even while dying. There's another, quieter story from this same period that deserves telling, because it involves an entirely different kind of survival and an entirely different, more physically visible kind of scar. In the early 1950s, a Methodist minister named Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who had survived the bombing himself and later became one of the subjects of John Hersey's landmark book about Hiroshima, began organizing a support group in the city for young women whose faces and bodies had been severely disfigured by burns, leaving behind thick, raised keloid scarring. The women called themselves, with a certain dark humor, the Society of Colloid Girls, and newspapers eventually dubbed them Genbaku Otome, or Atomic Bomb Maidens. Some of them underwent surgery in Japan first, but plastic surgery techniques there weren't yet advanced enough to help much. Tanimoto, working with an American magazine editor named Norman Cousins who had visited Hiroshima and been deeply moved by what he saw, eventually arranged for 25 of these young women to travel to the United States in May of 1955 for reconstructive surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. They came to be known, in the American press, as the Hiroshima Maidens. Over roughly 18 months, surgeons performed more than 130 operations on the group, and the women lived with Quaker host families in the New York area during their recovery between procedures. One of the 25, a young woman named Tomoko Nakabayashi, tragically died during one of the surgeries. For the others, the experience was strange and layered in ways that are hard to fully untangle. Young Japanese women, many of whom had grown up during a war against the very country now hosting and treating them, becoming minor celebrities in American newspapers precisely because their bodies bore visible evidence of what an American weapon had done. It was, in its own complicated way, an early experiment in something like reconciliation, imperfect and uneven, arriving a full decade after the war ended, built on individual kindness reaching across a divide that governments were still working out how to bridge. That same spirit of individual reconciliation showed up again, a few years later, in the physical rebuilding of the city itself. A group of Americans, led by a forestry researcher and peace activist named Floyd Schmoe, traveled to Hiroshima on their own initiative specifically to help build houses for survivors who had lost their homes. In 1949, Schmoe and 3 friends built 2-row houses in the city's Minomimachi neighborhood. Word spread, donations came in from around the world, more than $30,000 worth by the time all was said and done, and by 1953, 15 houses containing 21 separate housing units had gone up, built partly by American volunteers and partly by young Japanese people from Hiroshima and Tokyo working side by side. At the construction sites, someone put up a sign, written in English, that read, "May the building of our home bring us together in mutual understanding and peace." There's something almost unbearably tender about that image, American citizens, entirely of their own volition, showing up with hammers and lumber to rebuild homes for people harmed by their own country's weapon, working alongside Japanese neighbors who had lost everything, both groups choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, something other than resentment. The larger project of rebuilding Hiroshima as a city, rather than just a collection of individual homes, took on an unusual and deliberate character that set it apart from how most other bombed Japanese cities were reconstructed after the war. In 1949, the Japanese government passed the Hiroshima Peace Memorial City Construction Law, an extraordinary piece of legislation that granted the city special financial assistance and transferred land once used by the imperial military over to the city specifically for reconstruction, even though other Japanese cities, including Tokyo, had actually suffered greater total physical destruction from conventional firebombing during the war. The reasoning behind this special treatment was that Hiroshima's destruction was categorically different, the first use of a nuclear weapon against a populated place in human history, and that rebuilding it carried a symbolic weight the country couldn't ignore. A design competition was held for a Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, and it was won by a 33-year-old architect named Kenso Tange, fresh out of graduate studies at Tokyo University, whose winning proposal was striking in one very particular respect. Rather than filling the area at the bomb's hypocenter with new commercial buildings, which is what you'd normally expect a rebuilding city to do with its most valuable central real estate, Tange's design turned that entire area, roughly 122,000 square meters of what had once been the city's busiest downtown district, into open memorial parkland. It's genuinely unusual for a city desperate for buildable land in the middle of reconstruction to voluntarily give up its most central real estate for a park instead. But Hiroshima's leaders understood something important, that remembering, in this particular case, mattered every bit as much as rebuilding, and maybe more. At the heart of that park stands the skeletal ruin of what used to be the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, a building that stood only about 160 meters from the hypocenter. Because the bomb detonated almost directly overhead rather than to one side, the vertical force of the blast actually left portions of the building's walls and iron dome frame standing, even as buildings further away, hit by the blast wave at a more damaging horizontal angle, were leveled completely. That skeletal dome, its exposed steel framework reaching up against the sky, became known as the atomic bomb dome, and it remains, to this day, one of the most recognizable images connected to the bombing anywhere in the world. There were, understandably, calls over the years from some residents to tear the ruin down, arguing that the city shouldn't be forced to look at a constant reminder of its worst day. But in 1960, school children in Hiroshima organized a signature drive specifically calling for the dome's preservation, and in 1966 the city made the decision official: the dome would remain, indefinitely, exactly as it stood in the moment the bomb went off. The children understood something that some of the adults around them, quite reasonably, wanted to forget. That precisely because it was uncomfortable to look at, the dome needed to stay. Elsewhere in the park stands the cenotaph for the atomic bomb victims, erected in 1952. A simple arched structure sheltering a stone chest that holds registers containing the names of every hibakusha known to have died since the bombing, a list updated every single year on the anniversary. Most names on that list are Japanese, but several thousand belong to people from elsewhere, from Korea, which had been under Japanese colonial rule at the time and whose citizens had, in huge numbers, been brought to Japan as forced laborers, from China and other parts of occupied Southeast Asia, and even from a small number of American prisoners of war who happened to be held in Hiroshima that morning. The story of Korean hibakusha, in particular, deserves its own mention here, because it represents a kind of double injustice that's easy to overlook. Historians estimate that roughly 10% of all atomic bomb casualties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ethnic Koreans, many of whom had been forcibly relocated to Japan as laborers in the years before the bombing. After the war, these same survivors, if they returned to Korea, found themselves stripped of Japanese citizenship and, along with it, access to any of the medical relief and compensation programs the Japanese government eventually set up for its own citizens. It took decades of legal battles, individual court cases, and quiet advocacy work before Korean hibakusha living outside Japan began receiving even partial access to the same medical certificates and financial support available to survivors who had remained in Japan. Landmark Japanese Supreme Court rulings in the 1970s and again in 2005 gradually expanded these rights, but for many aging Korean survivors, recognition arrived only after decades of being, quite literally, forgotten by the country whose weapon had changed their lives forever. In 1955, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum opened its doors on the grounds of the same park, and it has since become one of the most visited historical sites in all of Japan, drawing more than 1 million visitors a year to walk through rooms filled with the physical remnants of that morning: a child's tricycle, its metal frame partially melted, a wristwatch, its hands frozen at 8:15. Scraps of clothing bearing the exact pattern of the fabric burned into a person's skin. By thermal radiation, the ghostly shadow of a human figure permanently etched into stone by the same intense heat, standing in silhouette exactly where a person had been sitting when the flash occurred. These are not abstractions. They are the actual, physical residue of specific human lives, preserved so that people who never lived through anything like this can come as close as possible to understanding what it actually felt like. Nearby, Hiroshima Castle, itself destroyed in the bombing, was rebuilt in 1958, and throughout the 1950s and 60s the city rebuilt its roads, its housing, and its public buildings, blending traditional Japanese architectural sensibility with the modernist concrete style that dominated post-war rebuilding across the country, all of it designed, this time, with an eye toward earthquake resistance that the original pre-war city had never needed to consider so carefully. The speed of Hiroshima's overall recovery genuinely startled observers who had assumed, based on those early scientific predictions about radiation and soil, that the city might remain a wasteland for generations. By the early 1960s, the city was substantially rebuilt. By 1985, more than 1 million people called it home, a population that had not just recovered but actually surpassed pre-war levels. The city that experts had predicted would remain barren and uninhabitable for the better part of a century was thriving again within 20 years, a recovery built on an almost unimaginable combination of determination, financial investment, individual sacrifice, and a collective decision, made and remade daily by thousands of ordinary residents, to build something meaningful out of catastrophe rather than simply trying to recreate what had been lost. None of this happened without real cost, though, and it's worth resisting the temptation to turn Hiroshima's recovery into a simple, tidy triumph story. The same reconstruction plans that gave the city its now famous Peace Park also displaced families from land their households had occupied for generations, land that got reassigned to parks and wide boulevards by planners and government officials, without much say from the people whose homes were being erased for the second time, first by the bomb and then by the blueprint. Many survivors spent years in temporary housing, working multiple jobs, sending children to schools that lacked the most basic supplies, all while managing chronic health conditions connected to their radiation exposure. The recovery was real. It was also unevenly distributed, and it asked an enormous amount of the very people who had already lost the most. What makes the Hibakusha story genuinely remarkable, though, isn't just that so many of them survived and rebuilt their individual lives. It's that so many of them chose, deliberately and often at real personal cost, to become witnesses. Speaking publicly about surviving an atomic bombing meant reliving trauma over and over, in front of strangers, sometimes in front of hostile audiences, sometimes at the cost of finally revealing a status they had spent years hiding. And yet, starting in the mid-1950s and continuing without real interruption right up to the present day, Hibakusha have traveled the world telling their stories, visiting schools, addressing international conferences, meeting with heads of state, speaking before the United Nations. Their consistent, unwavering message has been that nuclear weapons are fundamentally incompatible with human survival, and that no strategic or political justification can ever outweigh the suffering they cause. Between 2013 and 2014, 3 major international conferences held in Norway, Mexico, and Austria focused specifically on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and Hibakusha, including Setsuko Thurlow and others, gave first-hand testimony describing exactly what nuclear fallout does to a human body and a human community. Testimony that scientists then paired with climate modeling showing that even a relatively limited nuclear exchange between 2 countries could trigger global agricultural collapse and mass starvation far beyond the borders of whoever actually used the weapons. That combination, personal testimony plus hard science, built the momentum that eventually led, in July of 2017, to 122 countries adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations, a comprehensive international ban on the development, testing, stockpiling, and use of nuclear arms. That October, the Nobel Peace Prize went to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons for its central role in getting that treaty across the finish line, and Setsuko Thurlow stood on stage in Oslo to help accept it. As of today, 95 countries have signed that treaty and 74 have formally ratified it, a real and growing body of international law, even though none of the 9 nations that actually possess nuclear weapons, nor any of their closest military allies, have joined. That absence, notably, includes Japan itself, which relies on the American nuclear umbrella for its own security and has, somewhat painfully for many Hibakusha and their advocates, declined to sign the very treaty its own survivors did so much to help create. The treaty's first full review conference is scheduled to take place at the United Nations later this year, where the countries that have joined will assess progress and, among other things, continue working toward establishing an international fund specifically to support victims of nuclear weapons use and testing around the world, and to help remediate contaminated environments. It's a slow, procedural, unglamorous kind of progress, the sort that rarely makes headlines, but it exists at all largely because a shrinking, aging group of survivors refuse to stop telling their stories, decade after decade, long after most of the world would have quietly let the memory fade. And that, in the end, might be the most important thing this whole story has to offer, more important even than the specific details of any single monument or treaty or statistic. Time is doing to the Hibakusha exactly what time eventually does to every generation that lives through something extraordinary. It is quietly, gently, irreversibly taking them away. The youngest people who remember the bombing directly are now well into their 80s. Soon, and probably sooner than anyone would like, there will be no one left who can stand in front of an audience and say, in their own voice, "I was there." What they've left behind instead is something durable, a park built where a city center used to stand, a ruined dome deliberately preserved rather than demolished, a statue of a 12-year-old girl holding a paper crane toward the sky, millions of folded cranes arriving every single year from children who were born generations after she died, an international treaty signed by dozens of nations, and a Nobel Peace Prize awarded, in 2024, to an organization built entirely out of ordinary people who happened to survive something extraordinary and decided, quietly and stubbornly, to spend the rest of their lives making sure it never happened to anyone else. The oleanders still bloom every August in Hiroshima, right around the anniversary, blood red and white against the green of a city that was never supposed to grow anything again. The streetcars that survived the blast are still running their routes, carrying school children past the very ruins those same cars once rolled through as wreckage. And somewhere in Peace Memorial Park tonight, as you listen to this, there is very likely a small paper crane, freshly arrived in the mail from somewhere far away, being placed gently at the base of a statue by someone who never met Sadako Sasaki and never will, carrying forward a wish that was never really just about one little girl's own recovery. It was always, from the very beginning, about everyone who came after her too. If you found this exploration of Hiroshima's survivors meaningful tonight, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Candle and Crown Sleep Stories for more gentle journeys through history's quieter, more human corners. Let me know in the comments what part of this story stayed with you, or if there's another chapter of history you'd like to hear told this way. Until next time, rest well, and may we carry forward, in whatever small way we can, the same stubborn hope that kept a paper crane rising from a hospital bed all those years ago.